Our guest on the Spiritual Scientist podcast today is Dr. Robert Rose. And Robert has a PhD in the philosophy of science and studied natural science at the Goethe Arnhem in Dornach in Switzerland. And Robert was a lecturer in philosophy and anthroposophy at Plymouth University and has written several books, all of which can be purchased at Robert's website, which I'll put in the description at the end of today's conversation. But Robert, thank you very much for joining me. And actually, we just live down the road from each other, so we probably could have met in person, but I haven't got the equipment, so here we are.
Yeah. Great to see you, Mick.
Yeah, good to see you too. So, there's lots of different areas that we could explore. But one thing which has been a question that a lot of people have been asking me recently is about this concept or this idea of the threefold social order, which Rudolf Steiner spoke about and worked on bringing to fruition around the time of just after the First World War, I believe. But I was wondering if what we could do is if you could give us a sort of a brief introduction as to what the threefold social order is, or what social threefolding is, and then maybe we can see where we go after that. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's interesting because this idea of social threefolding is not what you find that Steiner put up front. It's a concept that arose within the process of developing his ideas about the social life. So if you look at his primary works on this question, the titles are more like The Social Future and Towards Social Renewal. So the terminology, I think, is quite important, because Steiner was looking at how society could be reformed predominantly in post-World War Germany and Austria. So it had a context. But one of the things that one needs to note about it is that, several things, one of which it's very brief. And I taught this at the university for about 12 years. And people were often wondering about whether or not it's still relevant today, this idea that he developed about the three different aspects of the social life. And one of the questions that often came up, and still does to this day, concerns the words that he used in the context of this primary idea. Just as a bit of a backdrop to the question of social renewal, this wasn't the first time that Steiner talked about new social impulses. And one of the main places where he talked about this is in his philosophy of freedom. So as you probably know, and probably most people watching this will know, is that this was a very important concept for Steiner, the concept of freedom. What is it? And sometimes this idea gets confused today with the concept of liberty. So when in his later writings and lectures he talked about liberty or freedom, he meant something different from what you find in popular culture. So in the philosophy of freedom, the idea there was more to do with a kind of inner thing, asking yourself the question if you are a free being, and how we can become conscious of things which lead to actions. And in the philosophy of freedom, it comes up mostly in chapter 9. So the philosophy of freedom is a kind of background to the whole of his ideas to do with the social life. And but there was another text where Steiner talked about anthroposophy and the social life, which is of great importance to his whole conception that he talked about later. And that is that takes anthroposophy, it's actually called Anthroposophy and the Social Life, and we'll come back onto that in a little bit. So Steiner had this idea that the best way to not just understand social life, but how to develop it is by recognizing the three different spheres or sectors or areas of the social life. And the first one is culture, the second is the political rights sphere, and the third is the economic sector. One of the things to notice is that he understood these in quite different ways from how we understand them today, and it's good to try and get to grips with that. So he made the argument that the cultural life should be primarily determined by an individual's freedom. So it meant things like freedom of conviction. So if you have certain, let's say, religious beliefs or scientific beliefs or artistic, or whatever is to do with a conviction that an individual has, should be governed by the principle of freedom. So that means there should be no coercion or compulsion to accept any conviction. So you can see within that idea is the seed of a tolerant culture. So
okay, so just to make it clear for me, we're talking there about freedom of religious practice, freedom of belief, freedom of what you do in the artistic life as a writer or a musician or a painter. What other areas are included in that, in cultural life?
Science, philosophy,
education
too is also primarily a cultural question issue. So within that sphere, you can see that the idea of mutual tolerance comes up very quickly. If you accept that not just that you can have your own individual convictions, but somebody else can, you need to be able to tolerate that. So there's no compulsion in this idea that a person can believe whatever they like to believe, even if it's crazy. So you know, if you just have to look at things on social media, there's all sorts of ideas and people react to them in different ways. Now, somebody who was culturally tolerant would say, well, yeah, I don't really agree with that, but that's their thing. And some of it can stretch you a bit. You know, if you look at some of the things that are around you, you may feel a little bit uncomfortable with them. But within that sphere, within the cultural sphere, this doesn't have an effect directly on society at large. It's purely individual. Whatever artistic work, for example, that you like, or whatever religion that you have, if that remains individual, there really is no problem. And if you are able to accept that somebody else has a different belief from you, and that's purely individual, then they should be free to have that conviction. So we know that in the past this wasn't always the case, and today people still try to coerce each other, but in different ways. You know, so it's like if you see some of these things that are going around at the moment on the London Underground, this artistic work to do with a certain gentleman who's invented a certain kind of electric car. They're not being very flattering towards him. They're trying to, I don't think they're trying to convince him, but they're trying to convince other people about what the nature of this person is. I mean, it's just a trivial example in a way. And so you get things like that, which are purely individual. The scientists can, you see these debates about global warming and so on. People agree with this, disagree with that, and you get this ongoing debate where people are trying to convince each other that I'm right and you're wrong. And it's as long as it's purely on the individual level, it's not really a problem at all. It's only when it becomes something embedded in law.
Okay, so that's where you cross over from the cultural sphere into the rights, legal rights sphere.
That's right. So when an individual then tries to convince, let's say, the government of certain things need to be done, such as CO2 emissions or anything really, then it becomes kind of binding for society, doesn't it? If the minute it goes into the legal rights political sector, if they turn that into a law, it becomes socially binding for everybody. And so that is where you begin to get problems in a certain sense, because Steiner's view was that in the political rights sector, the principle that governs it is not freedom, it's equality. So everybody's democratically entitled to into a say in how a society is governed. So if you think about the character of the political legal life, it affects everybody. If a law is made, it affects everybody. And so by like thinking, it should be democratic. Everybody should have a say in whether or not something becomes a law. And you can see in that we're not really quite there yet as a society, are we? It's like a person may put forward an idea and the government of the day says, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And then it's put to the vote and it goes to the House of Commons and the House of Lords. But it's not people like you and me. We
Right,
might disagree.
Okay. Yeah, you've got these
So we're
lobby groups and
that's right. So people, there's all sorts of shenanigans goes on, as everybody knows, that lobbying happens, and sometimes it's fine, it's not a problem, it's just somebody saying what their group of people want. But then when it becomes backed up by money, then that becomes another problem altogether. So the political rights sector is all about things which bind us together as a society, and it could be just on the national level, or it could be on an international level. So this is what makes this legislation concerning CO2 emissions is interesting from a certain point of view, is that it's become international. There's so many international agreements on this question, and so that's a kind of a way of understanding what the political right sector is like, is because it binds people into certain agreements and so on. We're still not quite there. I'm a firm believer personally in having more democracy, that certain decisions should not be in the hands of 20 people, that certain things should be up to the electorate as a whole to democratically decide upon. That's something that as a society we need to work on, I think, quite a lot.
So you're suggesting like referendum?
Yes, I mean, you'd have to, I mean, it's a research question, really. You'd have to look at what level would be right for the electorate to be involved in. I mean, some of it is done by the MPs who are representatives of their community. Some of it is not really worthy of the electorate looking at, probably. But some larger things may well be, so we know, for instance, that every year the government has a budget and it spends so much billions of pounds every year. That in itself is a problem for social threefolding, but that is as it is. So the question then would be should the electorate get involved in deciding where money goes to? Because the counter side of money are rights questions, so they connect to each other in a certain sense, which we'll come on to in a minute. So moving on to the economic sector, and this is in my experience of teaching this, there's always the biggest questions come up in the economic sector, because it bites directly into everybody's life, doesn't it? How much money you get. It sounds in a way a little bit crass to begin with, but it affects the other two sectors, doesn't it? If you think about, if you there may be something in the cultural sector that you might like to participate in, but you can't because you haven't got the money. You know, so if you're a big opera fan and you like to see it live, that's a big problem. You know, so if you look at the prices to go and see the opera in London, in Covent Garden or wherever, my son went there recently. He had to save up for it. I think it cost him £100 for one evening.
Oh, is that right? That's interesting. Yeah, just and the difference in different countries. I was in Russia in St. Petersburg in 2004, I think it was, and everybody goes to the opera. Just everybody, your average person on the street goes because it costs like, I don't know, the equivalent of a pound or something for everybody to go. And it was, I couldn't believe it because we went along. I think we had to pay a little bit more as tourists, but it was actually the top. It was a guy I'd seen on TV, was the conductor, a really famous ballet and opera conductor, the
Yeah.
orchestra conductor. Yeah, so it was really amazing. Anyway.
Well, this is what's interesting about the economic sector is not so much to do with monies and productions themselves, but how it affects the cultural life of a person. So if you went back, let's say, to the 18th century, cultural life for majority of people who worked on farms was quite minimal. There was things like teething, which was monies to do with supporting the church. So 10% of your income, I think it was used to support the running.
Okay. Sorry, I heard that wrong. I think tithing. I've heard it.
Yeah, you say, yeah, tithing either.
Okay.
Either,
yeah.
So anyway, so this economics element is a big question, you know, and especially with what's happening in the world at the moment. Economics is, you know, a big question with regard to supporting pretty much everything. So it has to come from somewhere, and so when you look at Steiner's concept of the economic sphere, it is so radically different from what you get today. And so his primary idea in that area, well, he called it brotherhood. He said that the economic sector should be determined by the principle of brotherhood. It's a bit of an old-fashioned word. There are other words you could use for it. In another place, he talked about the concept of mutual aid, and so he was quite a fan of Prince Peter Kropotkin. Have you heard of him?
No, I haven't. No.
Yeah, he was a biologist, a Russian prince. He gave up his status because he wanted to be a biologist, and he was around about the time when Darwinism was a big debating point. So like turn of the 20th century, and so as you probably know that through Herbert Spencer, Darwin's concepts were changed into something else. So, you know, in Darwin, he talks about survival of the fittest. Well, he meant that in a biological sense, whereas Herbert Spencer wanted to apply that to the economic realm.
Right.
But his wasn't the only view that was around at the time. So this idea of struggle for survival, the survival of the fittest, found its way into economic thinking and into economic practice. Prince Peter Kropotkin, he had this concept of mutual aid. And he made the case that if you observe biological organisms, they survive better the more they cooperate with each other. But that wasn't very favorable, that idea at the time. But Steiner thought it was a great idea. And he said that the evolution of humanity depended entirely on human cooperation and mutual aid. And Steiner gave this idea in relationship to understanding what the economic life. So there were three dimensions for Steiner in the economic life. itself, and that was production, distribution, and consumption of goods. But all of these were determined through association, mutual aid. So things like what kind of goods should be produced were determined by everybody in the association. That means pretty much everybody, because everybody's involved in the economic life in one way or another. And so when it came to decision making, the collective of people would decide what should be made, how it should be distributed, and what people's needs are in the consumption sphere. Now, there's a note to be made here, and that is that when Steiner talks about meeting needs in terms of, let's say, monies that are received, it wasn't, they weren't just physical needs. And so not just things you need to eat or clothe yourself or housing, etc. He also talked about soul and spiritual needs. So you could say, for example, being able to buy a good book is the economic aspect of a cultural need. Now, there's huge areas to be discussed in that area because, you know, it's not just a question of saying what you want, you see, or making a claim for what you want, because everybody enters into some kind of mutual agreement, and a kind of a contract, as it were, as to what somebody can actually have. So there's an interesting dynamic between what somebody wants and what they can actually get. So,
yeah, because it'd be hard to know where to draw the line when actually I need 1,000 books for my library or whatever.
That's right. Well, I happen to have about 1,000 books.
There you go. Well, that's too many.
It is too many, but I don't have much else, you see. So
you paid for them yourself, though, I'm guessing, not from a cooperative who gave them to you.
No, that's right. Yeah. So there's lots of different elements that really need working out on a specific basis when it comes to, well, all of the different sectors, but in particular in the economy. Steiner didn't offer solutions very much. He offered formula to find a solution, and that's even more so today, where we've gone so very far in the economic life from how things were even in Steiner's day. You know, even if you go back 50 years, let's say if you go back to the time of the war, Britain produced nearly all of its own things, with one or two exceptions here and there. If you go even further back in time, most things in each country were produced by that country. But now the production line processes are unbelievable, very, very complex of things. I read an article about, I think it was a certain kind of car, I don't remember which car it was, about parts that are within this car. So sometimes you can see things like this car was made in Spain, but it's got components that come from China, and it's got elements that come from Bolivia. You know, so if you take the lithium ion battery, you know, the lithium might come from Bolivia, and that gets sent over to China, where they make the batteries, and then they send it to Spain, which they then put into a car that's got lots of other bits which come from other places. So it's like finding these production lines, it's like just so different from how it used to be. So raises big economic questions. And, you know, with what's happening at the moment with old Donald over the pond there, I don't think he quite understands how complex the economy is today, you know. So
so it's a bit like, no, just to mention that for a second, because it's a bit like, well, they are always accusing him of isolationism and all that kind of stuff, but it sounds like what he wants to do is to kind of go back to that, right? And to some degree, he thinks he can go back to that, of America producing most of its own goods. But I think, well, my question is, and I'm not getting political here at all, but you know, just the question is that even possible now with what, like with the example you just gave with that car?
I would think that first thing is if it is possible, it will take a long time. You know, so you can't just flip it overnight. You can't just slap on tariffs and hope things are going to turn out okay, because in the short run, and by short run I mean like 5 or 10, 20 years, you know. So if you take, for example, the steel industry in Britain, it's gone really downhill since, I mean, I grew up in a steel city, one of the biggest steel producers in Britain.
What city was that, Robert?
Sheffield.
Sheffield.
Yeah, so the steel was made in Sheffield. I'm not entirely sure where they got the ore from, but and lots of things were also made. So it wasn't just about steel production. It's not so straightforward to just flip that around. You can't just create a steel industry overnight. It takes years to do it, and it took, I don't know, maybe 100 years to get to the point where you had lots of steel industries around. Maybe you could do it quicker these days, but you're not going to change it quickly. It takes a lot of time. So
but yeah, but does it kind of makes sense, doesn't it, for each country to be producing their own things to some degree, doesn't it? I mean, I know we're in this global economic order now, but it sort of makes sense, doesn't it, that the people who live and work in a place make what they use there rather than transporting it halfway across the world. I don't know.
Well, this was Steiner's view in 1919. He said that at that time it would be best if most countries were by and large self-sufficient, and you only import and export those things which you haven't got. So a typical example at the time might have been bananas, which is just a case of moving one thing from one place to another.
So move your bananas.
Yeah, so like go back to bananas. So, but I'm not so sure now. You see, I think that might have been right at the time, and I think in terms of some things, it might be fairly straightforward to go back to that. So, if you travel around Britain is very densely populated. But if you travel around, there's so much farmland which is just not being used. You know, so as you know, I live in Devon, and I used to teach over in Canterbury. So I used to have to travel up to London and then down to Canterbury, and I have to go across lots and lots of farmland, and they were mostly empty. There weren't even sheep in them. They weren't growing anything. And so you know, obviously this is not a proof, but it's something worth looking into. How much more food could we grow if we wanted to?
And
this
is a big one.
You know, so this is where we get into other sorts of questions, like, well, why did we chop down a lot of our fruit farms, which, you know, we did quite a lot of that back in the day. Well, we get this. If you go into a local supermarket and you buy apples, it says from New Zealand. Mm-hmm. You literally could not go any further before you started coming back.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly.
No, so it's like, why are we getting apples from New Zealand? Mm. You know, we used to have quite a variety of different kinds of apples in Britain, and you have to go to one of these alternative food shops in order to get Cox's. You very rarely see Cox's apples these days, and they're nearly always Braeburns, are they called Braeburns, and similar sorts of things. They're quite monoculture-ish. And so there are lots of questions like that. Yeah, the reason why they do it, as you no doubt know, is because it's cheaper.
Yeah, sure.
But how long? See, so that
yeah, but is that also an example? So probably, I know you're probably going to get to this anyway, but these three areas of the threefold social order, so the political rights sphere, the cultural sphere, and the economic sphere, Steiner wanted to talk about how they should relate to one another, and that It's not a hierarchy where one, because it feels like what we live in now is is the hierarchy with the economics at the top, and everything depends on that. So what, like you said about if I want to go and see the opera, it depends on whether I can afford it or not. So the economic is dictating the cultural life to some degree. And maybe in the past that was different. Maybe in the Roman Empire, for example, it was the political realm that ruled. I don't know. Maybe you know more about that than me.
Still money.
still money. Okay, right. Yeah.
Still money.
Still money.
You know.
Still money. So we've been in this order for quite a long time then. But yeah, maybe you want to say some more about that.
Yeah. No. On that question, I think that's been a common situation for many years. Obviously, there's been times when we've lived in theocracies, but the economic element has been very powerful for as long as history has been there. And I think that's right. We do live in a somewhat of a kind of economic hierarchy that determines things. It determines the kind of things which people research. So if you look at the cultural sector, getting research money to do so you can spend time doing the work for it, more often than not comes from people's economic wishes. So my original training was in engineering and electrical engineering, to be precise. And some of the things people used to be researching just struck me as somewhat absurd, So I'm not entirely sure why this was happening, but a friend of mine, he was doing research into electronically controlled kettles. And this kettle, it had a little LED on it on the end that told you the temperature of the kettle as it was heating up. In my naivety, I thought, how utterly pointless. So, I mean, it's just a trivial example, but there are other things that happen. People can receive funding for certain types of research, but it's not free.
Well, yeah, I think the example I thought of just before we got on the call was the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, exactly.
It's all about, well, it seems to be all about the money, not about healing people, essentially.
Yeah, I think you'll find a lot of research is like that. This is why humanities find it very difficult to get funding. If you wanted, for example, to study Rudolf Steiner's epistemology in a modern context, you really struggle to get some money to do that.
And yet you can get money to study some fairly obscure things like the temperature of the kettle on the way to boiling. And I think my wife was telling me something about someone at the university had done a doctorate or a master's on beards in the 18th century, which was that was a fun bit.
Yeah. Well, yeah, a lot of things do depend on the economic sector at the moment, and Steiner's idea was to separate them out. And I can see that there would be many challenges to doing that, because there comes the question: how does the cultural life get its funding? Things like the opera is very straightforward in a certain sense, although expensive. But if somebody wanted to research something which was not connected to what somebody participates in at the moment, how do they get their research funding? And this is where Steiner talked about free appreciation, which is a very complicated concept. Free appreciation, and he was of the.
So what do you mean? What does that mean?
In the easiest scenario, let's say somebody was interested in researching Leonardo da Vinci's early artistic work in relationship to technological invention. Okay, now somebody might say, yeah, it's just history, that we're way past that now. Somebody might think that, but you might get a multi-million or billionaire these days who goes, "Wow, sounds really interesting. I really like that work to be done," and they might fund it. But that appreciation has many antecedents, doesn't it? So how does a person come to appreciate something which to somebody else seems like nothing?
Right.
So,
Okay.
That links then on.
Oh, you're frozen up there, Robert.
Oh, okay.
Just give it a second, but I can hear you again now, I think. Okay, you're coming back now.
You froze.
Yeah.
Okay, you're frozen now.
I'm not sure how it's going to look on the recording. We'll have to see.
You're back. Am I back? Yeah.
I can hear
Okay.
you, but you're not moving. But anyway, I think you can keep going because I can hear you.
Okay. So, how does a person come to free appreciation? Well, in order to do that, they would have to have had an appropriate education.
Right.
Yeah, you see. So, if today I don't really know exactly what how people are educated, for instance, in the arts. So my son at a certain time in his school life went to a state school, and there was an art exhibition, and I thought this should be interesting. So I went to that, and all that was shown along the wall were a lot of screaming faces, and I think they were actually called the primal scream. Now, if that's what you've been educated in, how is a person going to then appreciate something, like the paintings of Raphael? It's not a primal scream or anything like that. If you take the School of Athens or the Disputer, there is certain stylistic of art that represents a certain idea, and so.
Okay, so if a person hasn't really had let's say, a rich, varied artistic education where they've seen the history of art, for example, so they get some sense of where artistic impulses began and where they've come up to in the present day, they're not going to have a sense of what they should fund, what they should appreciate. Is that
exactly? So, and this comes to a certain point, which I think is very important. When one of Steiner's supporters asked him, when will we be able to set up something like social threefolding? And this was after people had tried and it had not worked and gone catastrophically wrong in certain instances. And he said, when Waldorf education is sufficiently widespread. So I don't think he meant just the Waldorf schools as we find them today. I think he meant the actual education itself, which could actually be anywhere in a certain sense. But if you look at the spectrum of things that he talked about in to do with education, a great deal of it is incredibly rich in its scope, and would in principle support social threefolding. So the social threefolding depends on the education.
right.
And unless you've acquired an education by other means, then it's going to be really difficult to establish something like social threefolding in the world. Maybe you could get a small group of people who could work together in this way. I mean, there's so many things that, so many details that we can't really talk about in this short space of time. But I think that understanding these connections is very important, because there are some people who think that social threefolding would only work if the whole of society switches over to it. Well, that's more or less like saying it'll never work.
Yeah.
So what you need is a small group of people who are ready, willing, and able to work with it. But they would also, in turn, have had something like Waldorf education in their background,
or some kind of classical education to some degree. Would you say?
Yeah, no, that would help. There's certain forms of education which would not help.
Sure.
So
okay, so sorry,
you
just
need to look at.
yeah, just wanted to pick up on that point because
Go on.
yeah, I think this is really important. This is kind of the crux of it. Can it actually work? Is the big question. But some people have tried it, haven't they, in small groups? So it's not this sort of thing where it has to be society wide and everything has to change over tomorrow. It's more like you can do it and begin practicing it even within a family business or within small communities. Because one aspect, you haven't mentioned this, but one aspect that Steiner refers to as the fundamental social law is where practicing not taking the proceeds of your own work. So, let's say you team up with two other families and you work, that everybody works, but you don't take the proceeds of your own work. It's pooled and shared. Is that something that can...
the formulation was slightly different, because that comes from Anthroposophy and the Social Life, where he talks about how egoism impacts on society, and particularly in the economic sector. And he doesn't say that you don't take the proceeds from your work. He says the less you take from your work, the more can be made over to the community. Okay, so it's
okay. So yeah, got to be careful there because we're heading over into Marxist territory.
Well,
I guess
I don't know about that,
right.
But something different at any rate.
Okay,
It sounds almost like martyrdom.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, the way I thought of it was that the concept I had, which is obviously not 100% correct, was that I work and I get paid, and my friend's family have that, and then they work and I have theirs. You know what I mean? It's like that's kind of the conception I have, which is not quite right. Yeah.
You have to work out what you need.
Mm.
So this is in a little bit more detail about the economic sector. He said he formulated that in towards social renewal, when he said that you make a claim for the amount of money that you need for you and your dependents. And this used to be a really interesting conversation I used to have with my students, that a job doesn't have an amount associated with it. See, so let's say you get a job as a lawyer, and this is an interesting thing. How somebody gets a certain amount of money for a certain type of job is really peculiar in many respects, and it's hard to pin down. But what Steiner was trying to say, for what he was proposing, was that you'd have to work out how much money that you needed for you and your dependents. So let's say two people have effectively the same kind of job. They're both lawyers, let's say. If it's a single person, they have a certain set of needs. If it's somebody who is married and their spouse stays at home, let's say, could be man or the woman these days, let's say they have 4 kids, same job, should they get the same amount of money? Well, but in today's market, you would.
Yeah.
But in Steiner's concept, you wouldn't. So that's a very, very interesting thing. So if you have 4 kids, you would get more money. But by comparison, this reason why I picked on the lawyer occupation was that when I was working at Plymouth University, a job came up in their law faculty. So a lecture in law was offered £37,000. Okay, for a senior lecture position back in around about 2010. And there was simultaneously a job for a lawyer for the university, not a lecturer, for a lawyer. Their salary was going to be £60,000. Same training, doing different work, but it's still about law. And it's like, you think that is unfathomable, really. Now, I'm sure you could work it out if you went into details, but I just thought the bare fact of it was quite interesting. And then just on another example, which is completely different, and it's to do with wealth creation. So if you think about the fundamental social law, which is what we were just talking about, if you worked for a business, let's say you were a certain person who made electrical cars, and you had, if you were earning a lot of money, and so if you accumulated $400 billion, and if you were altruistic, not egotistical, you might make a certain claim for yourself. It could be still quite a lot. Let's say it was £1 billion. That means there'd be £399 billion given over to the community. That's 2 national health services approximately.
Wow, yeah.
So the mind boggles, doesn't it? And 3 certain individuals in America have a collective wealth of nearly $1 trillion.
Yeah, right.
So even if you said you can have $1 billion each, that's a lot of money. Think about what you could do with that.
You could go and build a rocket ship.
Well, this is the thing about the economic life. The decisions will be made collectively in Steiner's concept.
Right. Okay.
So
yeah.
If you
Good
were
example.
to ask certain people from a certain nationality, what would they like to see happen with $399 billion? I think top of the list would be free healthcare. That's just a guess, but I think it would be.
Okay.
And so
yes.
You can see, instead of money being locked away in somebody's personal account, it begins to flow into the community, and everybody's better off. So Steiner's concept of the economic sector is really seriously radical.
It certainly is, isn't it?
It certainly is. So to some people it would be terrifying.
Yeah, because we, especially seeing like what we've just seen in the last, since 2020, let's just say those words. There's, they're saying it's the biggest transfer of wealth in history that's occurred to people like Jeff Bezos in Amazon and places like that, where because we were all locked in our houses for a while and everyone had everything delivered and all of that stuff. And the question is it flowing into the community, and what impact's that having on the cultural life and on the sphere of rights and all that?
Yeah, well, this is the primary problem at the moment, is that these 3 areas are so intermixed. It's like if you were to make an analogy with your body, it's a little bit like having your digestive system in your head, together with your brain, and your heart's in there as well. I mean, you wouldn't survive for any length of time, would you? It's just that society is drawn out, and so this is the problem that we find ourselves in, is to begin with, how do we separate these things out? How do we begin to do that?
Okay, so just quickly, is that the idea that they're separate, they're separated out and sort of, I guess, autonomous to some degree? I mean, they still have to influence one another. They still have to be in dialogue.
Yeah.
So how would that work, or how has it worked with? Has it worked ever?
I think if it has, it's pretty much by chance. I might be exaggerating a bit there, but you know, so you could say, for example, if you took the political sector, Steiner's conception of the political sector, it has a determining effect. It's influenced by the other two sectors. So the political sector receives impulses from the cultural sphere. It also receives support from the economic sector through taxes, for instance. The reverse happens too. The political sector can make legislation which, let's say, puts boundaries around the economic sector. So an example where it has worked is concerning the amount of hours you're required to work. So if you think about people's incomes, there's boundaries around time, isn't there, amongst other things? And so that's linked into how much a person needs to live a decent life. So the two things are tied together, and that is something that's pretty much in legislation at the moment. So you could have, for example, I think Steiner talks about this, a law which determines what the economic sector, the boundaries of what the economic sector are, in order for somebody to have a humane life. And that could be working conditions. So the backtrack to the 19th century in Britain, the working conditions for many people who, let's say, worked in mines were terrible. And you had children working in mines, you know, at a really quite young age. And the amount of hours that people had to work in order to get anything that was decent. And a lot of the houses were owned by the collieries. So, and some of those houses, I used to live in one like them. They were seriously terrible, you know. So there's all these conditions, and that is a little bit of a success story. It could get better, of course, but that's the job of the political sector, is to set conditions for the economic sector on the one hand. On the other hand, it can also create a space whereby it becomes a legal condition that everybody is entitled to their own views concerning what is true and what is the nature of science or art or religion. So freedom of speech, freedom of expression comes into that. It becomes originally the freedom of expression was a philosophical concept, and it found its way into law. And that is a little bit of a success, you know. So John Locke spoke about freedom of belief. So if you backtrack the history of the 16th, 17th, and 18th century in Britain, there was a lot of religious conflict because of the emergence of the Church of England and the conflict with the Catholics and so on. And terrible things happened. And so John Locke wrote about freedom of expression, and we should tolerate each other's religious beliefs. But later on, that became embedded in law. It wasn't always the case. So that's a little bit of a success story. Today, you know, as you know, if you look at things in modern culture, we had the whole woke wars thing, and it's still trundling on a little bit in the background, although it's taken second place to recent events. Which more economic in nature. I always felt that was coming about, and but I used to watch some of these things which people reported about. What looked a great deal like a re-emergence of collectivist Marxist thought, but in a really quite a different form, you know. So I wrote something online, and somebody accused me of having white privilege, simply because I asked a question. It was just it was just a question. You would think like that, wouldn't you? Because you're a white middle-aged, well, a bit more than middle-aged now, but a white middle-aged guy, and you've got the time to do it. You have white privilege.
Mm.
And I've
Yeah.
got a pile of books behind me of things to do with things like that, and it was all very odd, you know.
Yeah, I've had a little bit of that myself occasionally, and I heard
Yeah,
a great song someone wrote, which was said, "I must have lost." The song was, I can't remember the title, but it said something like, "I must have lost my white privilege card." Yeah, thinks he should have had a card, but he lost it.
yeah.
Um, could I just ask one more thing, and I think we'll have to finish up. But so that we're still talking on a fairly macro level with things being passed into law in the country. What about on the micro level? Has it worked? I mean, I know that the Christian community, to some degree, the movement for religious renewal, which came out of Steiner's work, was inspired in part by Steiner's work, has used it to some degree, and continues to attempt to. And some Waldorf schools, I believe, have attempted in the past. But I don't know. Do you know of any successful examples
Well,
in a micro?
I think it's still quite a bit of a work in progress. So if you compare it to building a house, we're still a little bit in the stage of clearing the ground and putting the foundations down. So there are some people who say, "Oh yes, we did that in such and such a place," and I asked, "Well, what did you do exactly?" And it wasn't social threefolding; it was what you might call the gift economy. You know,
Okay,
so
yeah.
so that's like, I remember a Waldorf teacher saying to me, we just ask the parents how much they can afford to give. Well, that's a formula for a problem, because they weren't even saying what the school needed. So a Waldorf school needs to say what it needs, and then
Yes.
it needs to um, enter into a kind of negotiation with the parents, and that will be challenging, because there are many Waldorf parents who are very unacquainted with Steiner's concept of the economy, and I heard on one occasion a parent saying, "Well, why should I pay for somebody else's child's education?" So you'll get conversations like that, and how if a school wanted to implement social threefolding, that's just a very simple example of what they would have to negotiate. And it's all about that, really. It's all about people talking to each other and discussing things with each other and going through a process. Sometimes you can start off with one thing and it can be quite bad, and then it can evolve into something very good. And I think
Yeah, okay. Sorry, go
that
on.
you see, I think this is one of the major problems if you look at the political events that are happening at the time, today, coming from certain quarters. It's not really about negotiation; it's about projection, about force. So I think one of the things that people need to do is just to enter into an open-minded discussion about things. But there's still many challenges, because everybody has a history, so even if you're into anthroposophy and Waldorf education, it's a challenge. If you're not, it's a massive challenge, because it's like if you look at some of the actors that are involved in things today, there are certain premises which they don't accept, and if you don't accept those premises, you can't really negotiate with people. You just get people saying, slapping down some massive tariff and somebody slapping one back at them. So it becomes a bit like a tennis match to see who can hit the harder. And this is not negotiation. This is not collaboration. And I think that's needed. Today I would say that's, if you look at what's needed in the world the most, is that people simply learn to collaborate with each other and discuss things, even if it's difficult, and finding your way back to some kind of truthfulness. You know, it's like, I don't know if you watch these videos that occurred last week about the meeting with Trump,
Oh yeah,
Vance.
yeah. I saw some of that. Yeah,
Like, particularly Vance, he's getting all his information from Twitter. You know, is that a way of trying to get to know somebody? You know, so this was the primary thing that Steiner said. When you get into international relations, there's a threefold step, as well as threefold social order. Is 3 steps. First is understanding each other. It sounds so easy, doesn't it? Just understand each other. And he said, then after that, you can come to agreements about what international laws that there are. And then after that, what kind of economic relationships you have with each other. But unless you start with, do we really understand each other? You know, unless you start there, no way forward. It's just everybody asserting their national interest, and this is where this thing that you mentioned earlier about the fundamental social law is that when people are nationalistic, make this or that country first, or make this country great at the expense of other countries, you know, and it doesn't matter which country you are, they're all doing it now. You know, this is just enhanced egoism. And what we need to be looking at is moving towards a more altruistic stance for, you know, for international relations. And we have a long way to go. It's like this idea of social threefolding is a little bit like when Copernicus first put his idea forward. Most people hated it, you know, and it seemed nuts anyway. And Steiner's social threefolding does seem nuts to many people. I taught it for 12 years, and some people still thought it was nuts.
right. Yeah.
This guy, what was this? One student said, "What was this guy smoking?"
Yeah.
It is like Copernicus's theory, but for the social life instead of,
right.
you know, and look how long that took to become mainstream, hundreds of years. You know, and I think, you know, if this happens, it's going to take hundreds of years. So
Yeah, I think you really hit on the key towards the end there, to not just the threefold social order, but human social life at all, which is developing understanding for the other person, or even for the other country. And there doesn't seem to be much of that. And I think understanding history to some degree comes into that as well. And that could be understanding where the other person is coming from, ideologically, or just their background. And, you know, I think you and I have actually talked about this before in the organic world, about that, what Steiner called the thought path to Christ, you know, actually showing loving interest for the thoughts of another person, so that you can really understand and live into who they, you know, what they're saying, even if you completely disagree with them and think they're wrong and stupid or whatever. And that something new comes to birth when we do that. And that just doesn't seem to be happening. I work with a lot of people in America, and the difficulty, well, one of the challenges there is the people on the one side of the political spectrum actually think the other people are evil, and the people on this side of the political situation think the other ones are evil. They actually literally think they are evil. And so there's actually, where do you go? Where do you go from there? There's no even seeking to understand where the other person's coming from. And
I did a very interesting experiment. On YouTube, I subscribed to right wing channels and left wing channels, and I noticed that in the comments of each channel, there's never anybody from the other side saying anything.
right.
They're just not talking to each other.
Well, that's how it works, isn't it? You get caught into the, what do you call it, the sort of echo chamber of your own beliefs, and that walks you down this particular path, and you don't even know. It's like with that, when Trump first got in, the Democrats were completely bamboozled, because that everybody on their feed was saying, no, they're going to win, you know, Hillary's going to win.
Yeah, it is. This not having a open-minded dialogue is the starting point in a way for overcoming these polarities. It's like one of the areas that I've worked in the past is Goethe's color science, and the starting point for in terms of something like prismatic colors is black and white. So it's like the two different political ends of the spectrum. It's just black and white. There's nothing in between them. Just a hard boundary. If you get a prism, you see all these colors emerging that softens the boundary and creates a connection. And I think that is the role that dialogue could play. I mean, an open-minded, empathetic dialogue could begin to, set some things in place which might bring about something like social threefolding in 300 or 400 years' time, unfortunately.
Oh, that's a shame. I think, yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think if small groups of people, even in one conversation, can
I agree.
Attempt to do it on the micro level, then maybe it can spread out a bit quicker than that.
I do agree. When I said that, I was thinking about the macro level.
Sure, yeah. No, I'm with you there.
Yeah, so it's like these three principles of freedom, equality, and mutuality. They can happen on a one-to-one basis. It's only slight, but it's tangible and it's there. And in my semi-retirement, I run an electrical business.
Oh yeah, when I introduced you at the start, I actually said, and I wanted to say, more importantly than philosophy of science and all that stuff, you're an electrician. You actually do stuff with your hands. That's good.
I always like to negotiate things with my customers, and it goes very well. They often say that they've had problems with other electricians because they didn't know how to talk to them. Sort of like, here's the job, let's do it, and then sometimes make a mess. Whereas the process of negotiation as you're going along is really important to people.
That's a great point. And actually, on that note, would you come around and fix this light for me? I should have asked you beforehand, but I've got a little light fixture that needs fitting. Anyway, I'll talk to you about it after. But Robert, I'll need to finish up there.
Good.
Let's continue the conversation. Let's do this again because there's so much more we could say and more questions I've got to ask you. So thank you very much for joining me on here today.
It's a pleasure.
And just so that listeners and viewers know, all of Robert's books are available at his website, and I'll put the link to that underneath in the description on this video. And also just to say, if you'd like to support this podcast to continue, there are a few ways to do that. One is the subscribe star page. Another is buy me a coffee. You can buy me a coffee, whatever that means. But all of that's, you can also become a member and subscribe. All the information is going to be underneath in the description anyway. And thank you for tuning in, everybody. And thanks again, Dr. Robert Rose.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Robert. See you soon.
See you.